Hi everyone, happy Thursday to you wherever you are in the world. Just in case you've forgotten, and for those of you who are new, my name is Jack Farrell and I am the DME for Peace Project Manager at Search for Common Ground. Welcome back to the M&E Thursday Talks, or as I like to describe them, as the #1 webinar series regarding learning and what works, what doesn't and why in the peacebuilding, development and humanitarian fields. Today I'm delighted to welcome April Knox and Sarah Baum of Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, or as most of us know them, JPAL, who are going to lead a discussion on impact evaluations, what works in peacebuilding, reconciliation and dispute resolution. Just a note, if you have a question during the webinar, you can write it on the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once we reach the Q&A. I'll now hand over to today's guest. April, you're very welcome back to the Thursday Talks, and Sarah, welcome to the hot seat. The floor is all yours.
Great, thanks, Jack. So as Jack mentioned, my name is April Knox. I'm a policy manager at JPAL. I'm here today with my colleague Sarah Baum, who's a policy associate, and also our colleague Isabella Salgado is here to help us with Q&A at the end. We're the members of the Crime, Violence, and Conflict team here at JPAL, and we're excited to be chatting with you a bit about a recent evidence review that we compiled at the request of DFID, looking at what we're learning from randomized evaluations on a range of topics related to governance, crime, and conflict. So we're going to start off. Sarah will lead us through a little bit of a discussion on what are randomized evaluations, or RCTs, just for those of you who might not be familiar with this methodology. And then I'll get into some of the evidence synthesis that we've done. So I'll hand it over to Sarah.
Great, thank you so much, April. So as we know, poverty is a complex problem. Over the past 4 decades, we've made a lot of strides in terms of reducing extreme poverty around the world, but progress still remains very uneven across states. Now, this is especially true in states that are experiencing fragility, conflict, and violence, where poverty levels are on the rise. In these contexts, reducing conflict and promoting economic growth remain priorities, and foreign assistance continues to play a very significant role. Billions of dollars are spent every year on programs designed to fight poverty in these countries. The effectiveness of such spending, however, will be limited if governance, crime, and conflict-related challenges that disproportionately affect the poor are not effectively addressed. So at JPAL, we conduct rigorous impact evaluations, specifically randomized evaluations, to identify promising strategies for reducing crime, violence, and conflict. These types of evaluations can tell us whether a specific policy or program had an impact, how large that impact is, and if designed well, the study can tell us why we're seeing the results that we're seeing. These insights are central to ensuring that policies and programs do not fail the people they're trying to help, and that resources are not wasted on programs that are ineffective. So as a bit of background as to how randomized evaluations work, the main approach is really to create 2 groups, a treatment group that receives our intervention and a comparison group which does not. The comparison group, which we call the counterfactual, is exactly like the treatment group, except for the fact that they do not receive the intervention. So if we are looking to measure the impact of a peace-building intervention, for instance, before the program starts, communities or individuals or households are randomly split into 2 groups. If the groups are large enough and you compare the characteristics of these 2 groups, they should appear statistically identical. So that means, for instance, if you take the average of the 2 groups on income or age, they should be the same. These 2 groups continue to be identical throughout the program, except that one group receives the treatment and one does not. Thus, any difference that arises between them can be attributed to the program rather than any other factors. So randomized evaluations can disprove what we think is intuitive. For instance, if we simply measure the difference along the yellow line between where the program started, the orange line, and where it ended, we would measure a very high degree of impact. But randomized evaluations help us understand what would have happened if the program had not taken place, the green line, or our counterfactual. This way we can more accurately and precisely measure the true impact of the program. Now, this slide has a very different case. Even though we see a decline in our outcome of interest with the intervention, the yellow line again, through randomized evaluation, you can determine that people would have still been worse off without the intervention, the green line, are counterfactual. So without being able to compare the outcomes of the intervention with what would have happened without it, or counterfactual, we might have mistakenly concluded that the program had no real impact. As a note, RCTs, or randomized evaluations, are just one form of impact evaluation that can help us rigorously test the effectiveness of an intervention or a policy. There are many other techniques that may be more or less appropriate given your research question or the context that you're working in, and we are happy to discuss these more in detail during the Q&A portion of this webinar, but for the sake of time, we'll move on to some of the evidence. So I will turn it over to April.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So as Sarah mentioned, we won't go too in-depth on the methodology behind randomized evaluations. We realize this is a pretty quick intro, so again, happy to answer any questions about sort of design or any other methodological questions during Q&A. But something that we do want to highlight is that this methodology is increasingly being used to look at the effectiveness of various peace building and conflict prevention programming. So randomized evaluations really started to emerge about 2 decades ago within the field of development economics and were traditionally used as a way of evaluating effectiveness of education, health, agriculture programs. But more and more over the past 5-10 years, we've seen how this methodology has been applied to interventions relevant to this field, which is really playing a crucial role in helping us glean insights on a number of previously untested programs and assumptions. So with this in mind, our team, in collaboration with Innovations for Poverty Action, recently compiled an evidence review, as I mentioned, at the request of DFID, that offers a broad review of this expansion of RCTs in recent years to capture some emerging insights from across studies. So you'll see here on this slide the various themes that are covered in this evidence review. It's pretty broad in terms of categories because it stems from an initiative that covers governance, crime, and conflict. But today we'll focus specifically on this 5th bucket of peace building, reconciliation, and dispute resolution. But more than happy to connect with anyone who might be interested in other topics offline. And within the bucket of peace building, reconciliation, and dispute resolution, we're going to focus specifically on programs that have aimed to improve or increase social capital, social networks, and social contact either immediately following conflict or crisis or between groups that have historically been at odds with one another. And many of the randomized evaluations that have emerged on this topic have evolved from non and quasi-experimental literature that argues that strengthening social capital in the aftermath of conflict can be an effective way towards diffusing intergroup tension by developing pro-social norms within and between groups, so improving kind of relationships and trust between groups, increasing the exchange of information, so potentially there are information asymmetries that are causing groups to distrust one another, and this type of contact can ease those. Also promoting peaceful bargaining by encouraging kind of cooperative interaction with one another. And by doing so, this can help diffuse intergroup tensions and prevent a potential backslide into conflict. And one approach that has been particularly common over the past decade or so has been community-driven development or community-driven reconstruction interventions, so CDD, CDR interventions. These programs typically work by providing a grant or resources to a community coupled with the establishment of a highly participatory decision-making structure that then allows communities to collectively determine how to invest the provided resources in public goods. And these interventions are often delivered in post-conflict contexts with an aim of setting communities on a strong development trajectory. And when implemented in these settings, increasing social capital and cohesion, as well as reducing conflict, are among these programs' explicit objectives. However, if we start to look at the evidence base from randomized evaluations on the impact of CDD and CDR programs on measures of social capital and conflict reduction, we see somewhat disappointing results. There have certainly been some positive impacts of these programs. They can contribute to reconstruction, improve service delivery, and have generated modest economic returns in a number of particularly fragile settings. However, if we specifically look at outcome measures related to social cohesion, social capital, and collective behavior, there we don't see as promising of results. So a recent meta-analysis conducted by Kate Casey, who's a researcher, who's an academic at Stanford, showed that most programs had either null or mixed results when it came to social capital and collective behavior. Just to go through a couple quick examples, an evaluation of a CDD intervention in post-war Sierra Leone found no evidence that the program led to fundamental changes in local institutions, participation in decision-making, or social norms or behavior. And similarly, a program in Sudan that explicitly focused on restoring social cohesion post-war also had null results. So we mentioned CDD and CDR in particular because this is an area where we're actually starting to see a number of randomized evaluations that are producing kind of similar findings that are suggestive of how we might think about tweaking this type of programming in the future. So especially given the fact that CDD is such a common intervention in post-conflict settings, this is helpful in thinking about what are really the objectives that we're trying to achieve through these programs, and is this the right approach to actually pushing forward on those types of outcomes that we're hoping to see. So with this in mind, also recognizing the fact that CDD interventions often can be quite capital intensive, this leads us to question whether or not this particular type of intervention might be the most effective at achieving these goals of improving social capital, and getting us to think about what other approaches might be most cost effective. And there have been a number of other recent evaluations of less expensive interventions that have often different aims that have shown that it is possible to improve social trust and cohesion following conflict, at least in the short term. So I'll very quickly just share a couple of examples. The first of a transitional justice program comes from Sierra Leone, where a study found that a low-cost community-level reconciliation program that was conducted about a decade after the end of the country's civil war had positive effects on social cohesion and social capital. However, it also worsened villagers' psychological health, suggesting that these forms of reconciliation programs may need to be implemented alongside complementary interventions that provide psychosocial support. Another example comes from Liberia, which looks at an alternative dispute resolution program. And here they found that communities that received ADR workshops were more likely to resolve land disputes, experienced less violence, and reported higher levels of satisfaction with dispute outcomes, especially for long-standing disputes. However, these treatment communities also saw an increase in extrajudicial punishment, which is a serious side effect that may have resulted from increased emphasis on informal dispute resolution. And then finally, we're also seeing an emerging body of literature that evaluates whether media interventions, including radio programming and edutainment, can be used to shift social norms and build social capital, including in post-conflict settings. So there are a number of existing studies, including from Rwanda, Uganda, and DRC, that suggest media programs that leverage group discussion, peer influence, and dramatization can lead to positive impacts on social norms around dissent and dispute resolution and encourage interpersonal discussion. However, in some instances, media interventions have resulted in unintended consequences on attitudes and behaviors associated with conflict. For example, one media program in the DRC actually led to increased levels of intolerance. So I highlight these studies mostly because in most of these cases, these are the first randomized evaluations of these fairly commonly implemented programs, and they're really beginning to sort of shape our understanding of what's working and what's not, and also revealing some unintended consequences of these forms of programs. So in all of the examples I mentioned, there were some negative side effects, and this just really highlights the importance of having that counterfactual that Sarah mentioned to see both what the potential positive impacts of these programs are, but also helping us to inform how we might tweak these programs in the future in order to mitigate those potential negative consequences. Another form of programming that we're seeing a lot of increasing attention on between both implementers and researchers is social contact. And this certainly isn't a new type of programming. Social contact has been around for about 100 years. But we're increasingly seeing interest in understanding how social contact can be used as a way of building trust and stimulating strength and bond, particularly following conflict. So according to the seminal work of Allport, Clark, and Pettigrew in 1954, the contact hypothesis proposes that interpersonal contact across group lines can reduce prejudice, build friendship, and improve intergroup relations overall if that contact is positive, cooperative, endorsed by communal authorities, and places people on equal footing. And there have been many, many studies looking at the effectiveness of social contact across many different contexts. And in 2006, a meta-analysis of over 500 studies of contact programs found sort of a loose consensus that contact hypothesis generally works. That being said, there are a lot of open questions that remain. So if you dig deeper into that meta-analysis I just mentioned, of the 515 contact studies they review, only 3%, or about 15 studies, actually involve groups that are in conflict or were in conflict. And a more recent meta-analysis by Betsy Levy-Pollock and co-authors also concludes that contact typically reduces prejudice, but here they also highlight the fact that many of the interventions that they look at that are directed at ethnic or racial prejudice generated substantially weaker effects, and that there are also many gaps in studies that address adults' racial and ethnic prejudices. So most of these studies are conducted amongst youth, and there are a lot of open questions that remain about how this type of approach could be used with people later in life. And also just to highlight that there are a lot of methodological constraints when it comes to looking at the various evaluations of social contact that have been done to date. Most, when looking at randomized evaluations or other evaluations, most measure outcomes that are very short-term in nature or are measured using lab in the field games, which leads us to question whether or not the tolerance exhibited through these studies can actually spill over into real-world behaviors. But there are a number of new innovative studies that are looking at the effectiveness of social contact. So in particular, we wanted to focus on one study from Salman Moussa, who's a graduate student at Stanford, that's sort of hot off the presses. A working paper has only just come out on this study. But what Salma's doing is she's working in an area surrounding Mosul, Iraq, that was highly affected by ISIS, and looking at the effectiveness of mixed religion soccer teams on improving social bonds and social cohesions between Christians and Sunni Arabs in this area. So what Salma does is she recruits about 50 soccer teams that are Christian teams to participate in a 10-week soccer league. And she does this based on two conditions for participating. The first is that each team will be allocated an additional 3 players who may or may not be Christian. If they're not Christian, then they would be Sunni Arab. And all players had to complete a brief survey on their displacement experience before and after the league. So as you can imagine, when this intervention was first suggested, there was some pushback in the community from the Christian teams. When the first meeting happened about this league, actually some players immediately left the room when the discussion of involving Sunni Arabs came up. But Salma was able to sort of incentivize people to participate by providing professional referees in uniforms, reserving fields, providing trophies, making it a really professional experience. And this was sufficient in getting people on board to participating in the league. And the idea behind this program is that by bringing groups together in continued collaborative contact over an extended period of time, this would help to strengthen social bonds between those groups, would potentially reduce information asymmetries between these groups, and through doing so would improve general perceptions of the outgroup and increase social trust and cohesion between these groups, which would hopefully reduce the possibility of future escalations of violence between these communities. And what's particularly innovative about this study is that Salma thinks really creatively about measurement. So as I mentioned previously, with some of the social context studies, the challenge is that most measures don't extend beyond the day that the intervention actually took place. But Salma thinks about measuring not only sort of self-reported attitudes on trust and beliefs, but also really observing people's actual behaviors over the long term after the program has been delivered. She does this through a couple different ways. The first is by looking at tolerance on the fields. So after the soccer league ends, after 10 weeks, she measures whether or not Christians continue to train with Muslims. She also allows players to vote for a sportsmanship prize, where they have to vote for someone off of their team, so to see whether or not they're more likely to vote for Christians or for Muslims. And she also looks at tolerance off the field. And she does this by inviting people from both Christians and Muslim backgrounds to attend a neighborhood social event where it's very clear that people from both religions are likely to be there, and also encouraging folks to bring their families with them. And she provides coupons that enable the players to patronize a business in a Muslim neighborhood that prior to the intervention, most Christians noted that they would not go to that neighborhood. She also does a number of behavioral games to measure intergroup bias. One of them is basically allowing people to decide who they would trust in receiving a cash transfer on their behalf, asking if they would trust a Christian versus trusting a Muslim. Also allowing them to choose a hypothetical donation to an NGO of their choosing, one of the NGOs of which is clearly Christian oriented, and the other that's a bit more community oriented. And she also thinks about measuring spillover, so looking at how participation in this soccer league impacts other members of the community who might either be family members of people participating in the league or just neighbors, to see if it has any impacts on their measures of trust towards the outgroup. And she finds these are preliminary results. As I mentioned, this is still an early working paper, but she does find that in general, Iraqi Christians who participated in the soccer league exhibited more tolerant behaviors towards Sunni Arabs, and particularly on the field. So following the intervention, Iraqi Christians were more likely to train with Muslims 6 months later, and more likely to vote for a Muslim player who wasn't on their team to receive the sportsmanship award. However, she also notes that personal beliefs proved harder to improve. So beliefs about sort of trust towards Muslims, general perceptions of Muslims in the community, these didn't really budge. There weren't any effects on measures of empathy. So this is just something to note, and is fairly consistent with literature related to peace building and conflict prevention across other forms of interventions, just that generally behaviors tend to move a little bit more quickly than attitudes. And so in order to change attitudes, Salma suggests that maybe a longer term intervention, or an intervention that focuses more specifically on trying to have dialogue and try to address some of these personal beliefs, might be more effective in actually making moves on those outcomes. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go too in depth on any of these, but just to highlight that there are a number of other social context studies that are ongoing, including in different environments. So one in Nigeria that's looking at pastoralist conflict and how bringing farmers and herders together might, in sort of joint dialogue and joint decision-making processes, might help to mitigate conflict. And there's also a number of studies looking at how this type of contact can be used in refugee settings to improve relationships between refugees and their host communities. And then finally, just to wrap up, this is to highlight that quantitative evidence in this field of peace building is still modest. While we're presenting some preliminary evidence from a number of different types of interventions, there's still a lot of room for additional randomized evaluations on a range of topics, including things like motivations behind participation in violence, so trying to understand sort of non-material versus material drivers for participation. Also looking at organizational strategies of criminal groups and extremist groups to understand how they make strategic decisions about engaging in violence or non-violence in order to sort of achieve their ends. Also looking at security provision and efficacy of the justice sector, and building and maintaining stability after violence. So I recognize that was a lot of information to throw at you in a short amount of time. I encourage you to look at the GCCI evidence review. There's a link to it here where you can learn more about any of these studies. But also happy now to open it up to Q&A to answer any questions you have. So I'll turn it back over to Jack.
April, Sarah, thank you so much for such a detailed presentation. You guys got through a ton there, and I'm sure the audience are really grateful for your sharing today. I find that our Iraqi example fascinating, and particularly that point that you had on your slide around success. Teams that did better produced greater levels of trust and engagement, and I think that's really interesting, you know, that success breeds positivity. And a few months ago, we had Ala Al-Rabaha of I'm blanking on it now, but of the Immigration Policy Lab at Stanford, who spoke about the Mo Salah effect on the reduction in the level of Islamophobia amongst Liverpool fans back in June, which is fascinating. So our audience, now is your time to shine. We're open for your questions. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar or new to the Thursday Talks. You can submit a question in two ways. The first is through the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, where you can type your question. The second is to click on the hand icon to raise your hand, and it'll allow us to unmute your microphone so that you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. Just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on DM for Peace, so those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and the wider discussion. So our first question comes from my colleague, Maria Selby. And Maria writes, thank you, April. I was curious if the CDD, CDR studies mentioned that you mentioned showed disappointing results were programs within a particular sector, or if there was any indication of CDD, CDR programs that had positive outcomes and what those program approaches were. Secondly, with the Moussa study, did she also look at Muslim perceptions towards Christians?
Great. I'll start just quickly with the Salma study because that's the quicker answer. Unfortunately, she just given kind of the statistical power of the experiment, because there were many fewer Muslims in the intervention. She doesn't specifically look at outcomes of Muslim perceptions towards Christians, just because she wouldn't have the sufficient power to have those results. So that's the quick answer on that. In terms of the CDD, CDR programs, as I did mention, there are some examples in which there have been positive impacts of these programs, looking at different, depending on the outcomes that you're looking at. So in terms of improving service provision in Sierra Leone, for example, I know even long-term, about 10 years after the CDD program was implemented, they saw improvements in, I believe, community health centers and just general disbursements towards different community interventions. Where we're seeing the more disappointing results is for those that are looking at social context specifically. So I'd have to look back at the meta-analysis to see a bit more about the exact form of programming the CDD interventions took, but I hope that helps answer.
Great, thank you, April. The next question comes from Hannah White-Dobbs. And Hannah writes, when working on various RCTs of CDD, CDR projects, what other types of professionals do you collaborate with in the field?
Yeah, so for all of the randomized evaluations that JPEL affiliates work on, they're all done in close collaboration with those who are actually implementing the program on the field. So it's pretty much non-existent that a researcher would go into a place and say, you know, I just want to evaluate whether or not this works. It's usually the case that either a government partner, an NGO partner, a civil society organization is coming to us and saying, you know, we have this program we're working on. We want to understand whether or not it's effective. So how can we work together to design the program in such a way and roll it out in such a way that we can rigorously evaluate what's happening. So relies on a lot of close on-the-ground collaboration, both with the implementing organization. We also have teams of local enumerators on the ground who are the ones who are actually kind of collecting information about what's happening. Yeah.
Great, thank you, April. I'm going to use my moderator's privilege right now to ask a question that I've had on my mind since we started promoting the webinar. And in one of your earlier slides, you used the word rigorous and what a rigorous evaluation is. And I was wondering, could you guys explain what your definition of rigor is? What do you consider a rigorous evaluation?
That's a really great question. I'm not sure we have a formal definition of what we mean by rigor. I think the biggest thing that what we're trying to promote is just evaluations that are really thinking about establishing a strong counterfactual, as Sarah was discussing. So we recognize that in all instances, doing a randomized evaluation isn't possible. There are a number of factors that might prevent you from being able to do this form of evaluation. Maybe you don't have a large enough sample that you're reaching, so you wouldn't have sufficient statistical power. Maybe the intervention has already been rolled out, so it's a bit too late to think about randomization. Maybe it's a national program, so it's reaching everyone and you can't actually have a comparison group. So with all those things in mind, there's a number of other really great methods you could use to understand the impact that kind of help you to construct that counterfactual. So a lot of different econometrics techniques, including difference in differences, regression discontinuity, a whole slew of them. So from our perspective, I think we see all of those methods as being particularly rigorous, but it sort of just depends on the context at hand and what is best suited for the evaluation that you're looking to do.
So I think that is an absolutely brilliant answer, April, because one of the things I noticed after we had, I think yourself host a webinar a couple of years ago or a year ago, was everybody asking, I got a number of emails afterwards asking how they could apply RCTs to their programs. So everybody was asking, and one of the things I responded to people is does your program require an RCT? You know, and I think particularly in peacebuilding evaluation, we have to be very intentional with what we're doing and make sure that everything is tailored to the context at hand, and everything has conflict sensitivity at the heart of what we do. So I think that's you nailed that answer. So our next question comes from Carol St. Laurent of crypeace.org. And Carol writes, do you have a recommended resource or resources for designing social contact programs and monitoring?
Yeah, that's something that we have a number of researchers who are particularly interested in social context. So Salman Moussa, for example, has been a great resource, I know, to others who are looking to implement these types of programs. I think what's a bit challenging about social contact is that it can take so many different forms. It could be something like the sports league we just discussed. It could be something a little bit more sort of more deeply ingrained, like economic contact. So joint businesses, joint economic ventures, things like that. So it depends a little bit on, you know, what you're looking to do, but certainly happy to connect offline. Our email addresses are on the screen. So if you want to learn a little bit more about implementation resources or thinking about kind of appropriate evaluation questions, things like that, please feel free to reach out.
Great, thank you. And the next question comes from Nandita Palrecha from the Center for Civilians in Conflict. And Nandita writes, thank you for a very insightful session. You mentioned the unintended consequences that may accompany approaches such as transitional justice, ADR, and media interventions. Do you think there is a way to capture the unintended consequences of RCTs in peacebuilding contexts?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that's something that we try to be very cognizant of, as Jack was just sort of alluding to with conflict sensitivity, is thinking through what are the potential negative consequences of asking questions on particularly sensitive topics. So if it's a community that's recovering from conflict, what are the possible consequences of, asking about that conflict. Part of what randomized evaluations do is, in some cases, we're gathering information on both the treatment and control group, depending on sort of how the evaluation is designed. So in some cases, we're asking those sensitive questions of both people who received the intervention and those that didn't. In other cases, we can use things like administrative data. In those cases, we're seeing less of, sorry, I'm thinking this through as I'm speaking. So in those cases, I think that we're seeing more just the results of the intervention and not the result of, actually asking potentially difficult survey questions. But I think what we always try to do is think about what are sort of psychological resources that we can point people to, what are the ways that we can mitigate harm in any way possible of doing these type of surveys. And of course, always allowing people the opportunity to opt out, making sure consent is something that we think about, also going through IRB approval processes. But it's certainly a valid question.
Thank you, April. Our next question comes from Bob Berg, and Bob is an old friend of the webinars. And Bob writes, a large donor like DFID may well like programs with a larger scale of impacts. Did you find a greater interest in the mass media results, or is there a bigger potential for any other strategy that you studied?
Yeah, I think just given how nascent the evidence base is so far, we're a bit hesitant to say, any of these particular interventions are kind of, like a silver bullet or anything like that, and should definitely be replicated or scaled up. I think we still need to widen the evidence base before we'd be confident saying that. So in putting together this evidence review, it's not meant to be kind of a list of programs that are proven to be effective and therefore should be done in other contexts, but more of an opportunity just to shed light on what we do know so far and to help organizations like DFID and others think about how they might consider investing in future programs, either to help kind of build the evidence base on areas that haven't been tested, but also to think critically about, where we have seen potentially negative unintended consequences of programs or positive effects of programs, thinking about how that might tweak what types of programs they're investing in.
Okay, our next question comes from Damir Asenaliev. Sorry, Damir, if I butchered your name, who is with the ISDC IGZ in Germany. And Damir writes, on CDD, CDR programs, how much evidence do we have on what extent is the amount of funding made available to the communities, and does it make any difference? My understanding is that the amounts are quite small in many cases, which do not allow significant change to occur, which makes it hard and may affect social capital and cohesion outcomes.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. As far as I'm aware from the meta-analysis, I don't think that particular question of the amount of funding is addressed, but I'd have to look back. So I'm happy to follow up on that offline.
Great. Our next question comes from Leslie McCulloch, and Leslie writes, hi, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. I'm interested to hear what conflict sensitivity considerations you take when convening both groups, given that one group will receive input while the other will not.
Yep, so this is something that it's part of the IRB ethics protocols we have to go through for all of the randomized evaluations that we're funding through JPAL. Certainly have to get that ethics approval first. This is something that we also think critically about in the consent stage, so making it clear. It varies a little bit by the intervention, how much information can be disclosed in advance without potentially having kind of implications for how people are potentially responding to survey questions, but certainly trying to be as transparent at the start of the process of, informing groups of whether or not they may actually be receiving an intervention, but also trying to make sure that we think critically about kind of the time cost on participants. So often there'll be some sort of way of making sure that participants get some sort of small token to show appreciation for their participation. But something that we also think about often within particularly the conflict and peace building fields is if there's ways to actually design the randomized evaluation so that groups, both the treatment and control group, actually are receiving some form of intervention. So there are ways to design something so that you're just sort of testing basically tweaks to the program. So one group, there's a study in the DRC, for example, that's looking at the effectiveness of various forms of delivering food aid. And what they do in one instance is they provide vouchers, and in the other instance, they provide direct cash. And so in this instance, both groups are still receiving some form of intervention, which is seen as being really vital to that population. But it's more testing whether or not the mechanism behind how that intervention is delivered is effective. And there's also ways you can think about sort of doing a phase-in design where maybe not all groups will receive the intervention initially, but within a year or 6 months, all groups would actually be able to receive the intervention. So those are some of the things to keep in mind.
Great, thank you, April. So I'm going to use this as our last question, and I know this is an emerging area, so I'm not sure you guys will have a comprehensive answer, but this question comes from Sean Finity. And Sean writes, have other quasi-experimental and qualitative evaluations being conducted on similar social contact interventions, such as the Iraqi soccer camp example shared? And if so, how do their findings square with experimental design evaluations, such as the one presented?
Yeah, so in that meta-analysis I mentioned from 2006, I think it is, they look at evaluations of social contact programs. It's over 500 evaluations that have been conducted using a really wide range of methods, so including qualitative studies or kind of quasi-experimental studies, as well as some RCTs. And so the main takeaway from that meta-analysis is that contact generally tends to be effective, but what we do see is that there just haven't been that many rigorous evaluations or randomized evaluations of contact programs in post-conflict settings. So I'm not, off the top of my head, I don't know as much about qualitative examples from a place like Iraq. I'm sure there are some studies, could do some digging into that and let you know how those results square.
Great. April, thank you so much. And Sarah, thank you so much for being wonderful hosts today. For those of you in the audience who are curious about learning more or would like to dig into the other parts of the research that we didn't get to touch on today, I have just put the link to April and Killian, who wasn't able to join us today, their blog in your chat function right now. Thank you guys for being wonderful hosts. I really enjoyed your presentation. And thank you to the audience for continuing to ask questions, to provoke discussion, and really help us learn together as a field. Like I said nearly every one of these webinars is the best part of my job, and I love the opportunity to learn from and learn with all of you. So thank you for joining this edition of the MD Thursday Talks. Like I said, this webinar was recorded, so we're going to post it on our media gallery later today. So please return to it, share it with your colleagues, and feel free to continue the discussion in the comments. The next Thursday Talk is going to be on November 21st, so 2 weeks' time, and we will be with our friends from the Peace Tech Lab talking about hate speech and technology. So it should be fascinating. I look forward to seeing you online then. April and Sarah, thank you again. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.
Thanks. Thank you.